Hey guys, Mr. Rogers here. Today we're going to do a lesson with equivalent fractions. But to be able to talk about equivalent fractions, let's do a quick recap on what a fraction is. So when I say a fraction, all I mean by a fraction is just a way to show part of a whole. Okay? So if I tell you, or I give you the fraction 2/3, when I represent that, all that means is my part is my top number, which is my numerator. That's my part. And my whole is the bottom number, which is the denominator. Okay? So in my fraction 2/3, that means my 3 is my whole. So I'm going to split my object into 3 sections because 3 is my whole and 2 is my part. So I have 2 parts shaded. Okay? So, when I talk about equivalent fractions, what I mean is that means that it's two fractions that have different numbers, but they represent the same part of a whole. So, if I use my 2/3, okay, over here, that means my fraction that's equivalent to 2/3 is going to be used with different numbers, but when you simplify that second fraction, that means you're going to have the same fraction that equals 2/3. So you might be thinking, well, how am I supposed to know how to get to equivalent fraction? All you have to do with a fraction to make it or to show what its equivalent fraction is just to multiply the numerator and the denominator by the same whole number and you get a equivalent fraction. So if I look at my 2/3 right here, I'm going to put it down here. Okay, because I'm looking for another fraction that's equivalent, which just means that it's equal to. Okay, to get an equivalent fraction, all I have to do is multiply my numerator and my denominator. So I like to keep things simple, so I like to multiply my fractions by like either 2 or 3 to get the equivalent fractions if you can. Sometimes you might not be able to, but I like to multiply by easy numbers. So I'm going to multiply my top number, my bottom number, which is my numerator and denominator, by 2. 2 times 2 is 4. 3 times 2 is 6. So if you look here, 2/3 is the same as 4/6. Okay? Because if I take 2 and I divide it by 2, I'm left with 2. And if I divide my bottom number by 2, because I'm simplifying it, 6 divided by 2 is 3. So I'm left with my 2/3, what I started with. Okay? So we are going to look at a recipe and use the fractions in a recipe to create some equivalent fractions. All right, so on this board, I have a recipe for peanut butter cookies. Okay, if you're like me, I love to be in the kitchen. I like baking things, I like cooking things, but if I had a choice of what I could do when I'm not in the classroom, it's baking. Baking is my go-to thing, and anything I bake with that has peanut butter is my favorite. So, hence the recipe I pulled off of the internet. I used it off of Food Network. Okay, so I took the recipe peanut butter cookies because my favorite type of cookies is peanut butter. So let's look at our fractions in our recipe. So my recipe calls for 3/4 cup of butter, 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda, 2/3 cup of light brown sugar, and a 1/2 cup of all-purpose flour. Okay, so I'm going to be coming up with 2 equivalent fractions. Okay, so if I look right here, so my first number is 3/4. Okay, starting with 3/4. Okay, so like I said, I like to start multiplying things by 2 because it's an easy number. When you start with an easy number, you're not going to get like a really gigantic number, so that's why I like to start with 2. So what I would do, I would multiply my numerator and denominator by 2, because to get to equivalent fractions, what you do to your top number, you have to do it to the bottom number. If not, then your fractions aren't going to be equivalent. So 2 times 3 is 6. 4 times 2 is 8. Okay? So you see right here, I'm taking my 3/4, then I'm bringing over my 6/8, okay? Then I'm going to delete that or erase it. Then now what I'm going to do, since I'm coming up with two equivalent fractions, I'm going to have to multiply these by another number too, okay? So I did just my plain fraction right here, and then these I multiplied by 2, okay? Now I'm going to multiply by 3 because I need to come up with another equivalent fraction. So I'm going to multiply my numerator and denominator by 3. 3 times 3 is 9. 4 times 3 is 12. Okay, and all those were multiplied by 3. Okay, so my equivalent fractions for 3/4 are 3/4, 6/8, which I got that by multiplying my numerator and denominator by 2, and then 9/12. And I got 9/12 by multiplying my numerator and denominator by 3. Okay, so let's look at our second ingredient. 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda. So if I have 1/4 over here, and I start out with, because I'm starting out with my base of 1/4, I'm going to multiply my numerator and denominator by 2. 1 times 2 is 1. Or, I'm sorry, 1 times 2 is 2. Sorry. Then 4 times 2 is 8. Okay. Then if I do 1/4, I multiply my top and bottom number by 3. 1 times 3 is 3. 4 times 3 is 12. So my equivalent fractions for 1/4 is 2/8, which I multiplied my numerator and denominator by 2, then 3/12. And that's the result of multiplying my numerator and denominator by 3. All right, let's look at 2/3. That's my next ingredient. 2/3 cup of light brown sugar. Okay, so I'm going to start off multiplying by 2 with my numerator and denominator. 2 times 2 is 4. 3 times 2 is 6. Okay, then if I multiply my numerator and denominator by 3, 2 times 3 is 6. 3 times 3 is 9. Okay, then my equivalent fractions for 2/3 is 4/6, because I multiplied my numerator and denominator by 2, and 6/9 because I multiplied my numerator and denominator by 3. My last ingredient is 1/2. Okay, so 1/2. When I multiply my numerator and denominator by 2, 1 times 2 is 2. 2 times 2 is 4. When I multiply it by 3, my numerator and denominator, 1 times 3 is 3. 2 times 3 is 6. Okay? So all that you have to do is to take your fraction in a recipe, and to get the equivalent fraction, you just have to multiply the numerator and denominator by the same whole number. Okay? Alright guys, I am back with the new recipe, okay? So my new recipe, again, has to do with peanut butter cookies. Since I like peanut butter cookies so much, I decided to get another peanut butter cookie recipe. Okay, so this recipe calls for 1/8 cup of all-purpose flour, 1/3 teaspoon of baking soda, 1/6 teaspoon of salt, and 1/4 cup of peanut butter. If you notice, this isn't the full recipe for these ingredients, okay? What I did, I took a recipe, or two recipes in this case, off of Food Network, okay? And all I did was pull out the ingredients that had to deal with fractions. So if my ingredient was like a whole number, like 2 cups, or like 1 cup, 3 cups, whatever it was, I didn't bother with that, okay? All I did was take my ingredients that have fractions in them, and that's the ingredients I'm working with, okay? So let's look at these fractions and come up with two equivalent fractions with each of these. So let's start with 1/8, okay? So if I have 1/8, and I start with multiplying my numerator and denominator by 2, 1 times 2 is 2, 8 times 2 is 16, okay? then 1/8, and I multiply it by 3 on the numerator and denominator. 1 times 3 is 3. 8 times 3 is 24. Okay, let's move on to my next ingredient. 1/3 teaspoon of baking soda. Okay, so 1/3, and I start with multiplying my numerator and denominator by 2. 1 times 2 is 2. 3 times 2 is 6. Then 1/3, and I multiply it by 3 on my numerator and denominator. 1 times 3 is 3. 3 times 3 is 9. Okay, then 1/6 of salt, 1 teaspoon of, or 1/6 teaspoon of salt, I'm sorry. Okay, so I start with my multiplying both the numerator and denominator by 2. 1 times 2 is 2. 6 times 2 is 12. 1/6, multiply it by 3 on the top and bottom. 1 times 3 is 3. 6 times 3 is 18. Then my last ingredient, 1/4 cup of peanut butter. We did this one just a second ago, but let's do it again. 1/4, multiply top and bottom by 2. 1 times 2 is 2. 4 times 2 is 8. Then when I multiply this fraction by 3 on the top and bottom, 1 times 3 is 3. 4 times 3 is 12. Okay, so you all see right here, and each of these ingredients, my first number is my base fraction with my ingredient. And then after it was 2 fractions that are equivalent, okay? And remember, an equivalent fraction is just a fraction that have different numbers, but they represent the same part and whole of your original fraction, okay? So on this example, 1/8 is equal to 2/16, because if you take 2/16 and you simplify it, you'll get 1/8. Okay, that's all what an equivalent fraction is. It's you starting with your base fraction, and with your equivalent fraction, if you were to simplify that equivalent fraction, you would get your base fraction. Okay, equivalent fractions aren't that difficult if you know how to make it into an equivalent fraction. Okay, and to make an equivalent fraction, you just take your base fraction, or the fraction that you're given, and you multiply both the numerator and the denominator by the same whole number. And when you do that, you get a equivalent fraction. All right, I hope this video helped you guys. Until next time, have a good day.